business. And it even gets more complex when we think about circular supply chains. My name is Hannah Zülke. I'm a partner with Roland Berger, focusing on decarbonization and circular economy in supply chains. And I'm looking forward to today's session. Before we will go into the panel, I would like to welcome Mattias Fromeri, Sweden's Climate Ambassador at the Ministry of Climate and Enterprise. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So good to be with you at your pavilion. And indeed, as you were saying, I think very much on this COP is about collaboration. And of course, the importance of us all coming together to increase our ambition when it comes to implementing the targets we set ourselves in the Paris Agreement. I'd like to highlight just a couple of principles and points from a Swedish perspective before going into the panel. And maybe firstly, stating the more obvious point that by adopting circular principles, we can significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions. There are figures saying that we could reduce CO2 emissions by 48% by 2030 and by 83% by 2050 globally by adopting circular practices. Secondly, some key enablers that we would see for circularity and its link to supply chains would include, for example, technological innovation by using advanced technologies such as precision agriculture, more sustainable processing and packaging solutions, and enabling resource-efficient production and waste reduction. We could also increase circularity and reduce investments. And of course, also highlighting the importance of public investments in both research and establishing those kind of value chains to include and enhance technological innovation. Secondly, from a government perspective, obviously we see the need for supportive policies in so many ways, including incentives to be set for sustainable practices and also regulatory frameworks that can drive wider industry adoption of these kinds of practices. And of course, speaking at the COP, at what we see the role of these kinds of meetings, setting a sort of a global approach to regulatory cooperation and regulatory reform in the various parties who have signed up to the Paris Agreement, making sure that whatever we decide on a global level is also then implemented on the national level to ensure that we're living up to what the kind of global commitments that we set ourselves. And then maybe a third enabler in this aspect is, of course, collaboration across the value chain among businesses, governments, and consumers. And I would say also that these sort of three, not least businesses and consumers, but as well as governments, are interacting in a way which, of course, we as governments need to be supporting. How can we be supporting business practices which also support for consumers to adapt to a circular economy? And just sort of a couple of meters down the hall from this pavilion, sorry. It's better? Thank you. Just a couple of meters down the hall from this pavilion, we have the Swedish pavilion, where we have a number of Swedish business actors present, who are, most of them, I would say, are very much into developing their sustainable business practices, and not least when it comes to circularity across their value chains. Both companies which are mainly focused on our domestic market, but also our global companies like H&M and IKEA and Volvo, who are increasingly adopting these kind of circular supply chains, for example, with IKEA even designing their furniture from a perspective of how to disassemble the furniture once it's being used and how it also can be recycled. I think these are the kind of examples which all of us can be highlighting in terms of the kind of practices which are developing already within our business community to support us all in achieving that kind of circular economy. And thirdly, maybe also highlighting from a Swedish perspective that we have set ourselves what we hope to be ambitious goals to be one of the world's first fossil-free welfare nations by 2045 at the latest. We also adopted a circular economy strategy in 2020, which outlines measures to promote circular business models and sustainable consumption. A couple of examples also maybe from the economy at large. For example, within the transport sector, we're seeing that the Swedish car manufacturers, such as Volvo, are committed to using at least 25% of recycled plastics in new cars by 2025, so already next year. Also, we're seeing an increasing trend of remanufacturing of used parts that are restored to like new condition, reducing the need for new materials and thereby also lowering the environmental impact. And also examples such as responsible sourcing, making the supply chains more sustainable by sourcing materials responsibly and reducing emissions from logistics. And in other sectors such as fashion, we're also seeing how a company like H&M have committed to using 100% recycled or sustainable produced materials by 2030. So encouraging the use of sustainable materials like recycled polyester and organic cotton. Secondly, also collecting, recirculating, and recycling material. So establishing programs that encourage customers to return used clothing, which is then recycled and repurposed. And for those of you who have visited H&M or other such stores, you can bring your used garments, you take them to the store, you even get a bonus for when you go shopping next time. So in a way, you encourage more shopping, of course, but by using those kind of materials, we're also bringing circularity into the supply chains. And again, sort of that interaction between the business actor and the consumer, incentivizing that kind of behavior. And I would say Swedish fashion brands more generally are also exploring circular fashion models, such as leasing clothes, offering repair services, and designing clothes for better longevity. And here I think also an example, just looking to, as I mentioned previously with IKEA, that this is sort of by just designing your products also in a way to make sure that you can you build in circularity in the actual design of the product. And maybe finally, just a couple of words on COP29 itself. Many of us are speaking of this COP as a finance COP to ensure that there is sufficient finance, not least for developing countries, to accelerate their transition to net zero. But I would say equally important at this COP is also ensuring that we have a follow-up from last year's decision at COP28 in Dubai on the global stocktake, where one of the key commitments which all of us made is the transition away from fossil fuels. And of course, fossil fuels, as you know, is not only used in energy systems, but also in various types of industrial processes. So here again, by designing new types of products, we can also ensure that we're transitioning away from fossil fuels within industry and making sure that we can apply these kind of new business models across businesses globally. And I think that that's really something which we hope to see as well coming out from COP29, so that we're reassuring and reconfirming the commitments that we did at COP28 when it comes to the global stocktake and the transition away from fossil fuels. And also ensuring that we have strong signals to all parties of the Paris Agreement in their elaboration of the NDCs next year, when all countries are expected to produce their new nationally determined contributions, to make sure that we're applying these kind of principles I just referenced earlier in terms of ensuring the regulatory framework is fit for purpose for a circular economy, but also providing these kind of incentives for both businesses and consumers in changing business models, but also, of course, changing consumer behaviors, and by doing so, reducing emissions and making sure that we limit temperature rise to 1.5. So I do hope that also this seminar that we're hosting here today, or that we're all present here today, can be one of those inputs to countries' elaboration of their new NDCs and ensuring that we can see all these new kinds of business models for circularity reflected also in the new NDCs to be presented next year. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Matthias. And I'm really excited that you touched upon all the key aspects of the circular economy, not just recycling, what we tend to focus on a lot, but also reduce, repair, refurbish, remanufacture, and that we need to really rethink in order to make the circular economy work. I'm now looking forward to the panel discussion, which I think is a very interesting set of panelists. So Matthias, thank you for joining the discussion today also as part of the panel. We also have Timothy Mays-Dubois, Global Head of Institutional Affairs at Schneider Electric, joining us, and Panel Nunes, Director of Sustainability and Deputy Secretary General at the International Aluminium Institute. So may I kindly ask you to take a seat. Let me see. Yes, it actually works. Perfect. So let me start, Panel, with a question directed to you. I think if you dive into the circular economy, one of the first concepts or case studies you learn is on aluminum, specifically on aluminum cans, because you can recycle them. I wouldn't say endlessly, but maybe even endlessly, actually. So, coming out of the aluminum industry, what are the best practices that you think can be transferred to other industries in terms of increasing recycling, but then also how to design products so that you can actually enable recycling in the first place?
Thank you very much. It's a great question. Actually, it's very pleasing that you use the aluminium can as a great example of circularity, because we think aluminium is a great material that really promotes, the circular economy. It can be recycled pretty much infinitely. You do get some losses in the process, but the properties remain the same. And so it means that when you're looking for products that are going to last a long time, they're going to be recycled and the material used again. There's a lot of great properties for aluminium. So in terms of, I guess, the learnings that can be taken from the sector, is it great? So there's a lot that's been done recently on the kind of theme of collaboration. So there's a lot of collaboration that happens across the supply chain, from the primary producers through to the midstream, and then to the downstream and the can. And actually connecting up that value chain is sometimes a little bit challenging. We spoke before this panel a little bit about how fragmented sometimes it can get towards the end of the value chain, where the recycling happens in different ways in different parts of the world. So for the aluminium can, there is quite a big informal recycling sector, and in some parts of the world that's worked really, really well. So in Brazil, for example, they've managed to achieve 100% can recycling rates because of the informal recycling sectors. So you have these informal waste pickers that are going out there and actually collecting this material because it is of value. So there's an incentive for them to collect that material. So I think it's a great example of where different systems actually might work in different local contexts. In other parts of the world, you have things like deposit return systems. You have extended producer responsibility. All of these kind of policies that incentivize the capturing of that valuable material to be reused again in other processes. So I think there's learnings that can be taken from all of those sorts of examples in the aluminium sector and used in other sectors. And I know it is used in other industries and other sectors.
Thanks a lot. And I think especially if we look at industries with more focus on the base materials, recycling is, of course, the first scope and the first objective to tackle. However, other industries face different challenges, and here I'm looking at some of these specifically for Schneider Electric, because the more complex a product or a module, a component gets, the more you need to not only focus on recycling, but specifically about the other R's of circular economy. And I know that Schneider Electric is also leading the way in terms of circular economy. So what are you specifically doing in order to increase reuse, repair concepts, and in general increase the longevity of the product? And how well does it work? What do you see as challenges?
Thanks for the question. Thank you for the invitation. Thanks to the World Green Economy Organization for the kind invitation. Just to tell you a bit more about myself, I'm the head of public affairs of Schneider Electric. Schneider Electric is an industrial tech leader specialized in energy management and industrial automation. But in a parallel life, I'm also the co-founder of the Circular Fashion Federation, so I know H&M and their commitments in terms of circularity. And we have founded the federation in France 2 years ago, and we have 250 companies gathering the federation. So I know circular fashion and I know H&M. But going back to Schneider Electric, so we in Schneider Electric we need to electrify, digitize, and circularize the world to make it sustainable, to make it smart and green. We have been ranked ninth company in terms of by the Change the World list for circular economy, and we are one of the 3 lighthouses on circular economy by the WEF and by McKinsey. So in Schneider Electric, we offer end-to-end solution. Of course, we innovate at the stage of course, with always circularity in mind. We purchase sustainable materials, green materials. So we try to source and purchase green materials. We also provide services to our customers and our suppliers. It's a whole ecosystem where we try to help our suppliers and customers to circularize their business model. And of course, we reuse, collect, recycle, repair. So we apply circularity for our products, of course, because as you said, it's a huge part of the lower GHG emissions, but also we make it a business, and that's the most important because for us, circularity is profitability. So we make it a new business, and for us, well, we need to incentivize with EPR, of course, but we also need to find circular business models that are profitable for everyone.
To connect to that question, how do you assume the share of circular business revenue is going to develop at Schneider Electric, but in general in your industry? And also to connect to that, how do you see the role of supply chains in order to support this circular business?
I guess that the world of tomorrow will be 100% circular. I hope so. So I guess that the business model of tomorrow will be 100% circular. In terms of resilience, it's also key. We know the diplomatic geopolitical situation, so we need to be resilient and then to be circular. And in terms of supply chain, there are many challenges. As I said, we help our suppliers to decarbonize and to circularize their business model. It's a huge challenge in terms of transparency, human rights, because we take care of the suppliers, but also the suppliers of our suppliers. So it's a major challenge. It's a major challenge also in terms of awareness, where we need to consumer to be aware and well, we have a lot of customers stating that, well, if it's circular, then it's maybe less safe. So well, we need to ensure the same quality and the same price for circular products, but it's a huge challenge even with our suppliers. It's a huge challenge of local sourcing. It's a huge challenge of like complexity of knowing our supply chain, and of course of cost considerations. And well, we need to build capacity of consumers, suppliers, customers, everyone. It's a long road, but we intend to make it 100% circular.
Before we touch on the governmental part of it and the role governments play in order to promote the circular economy, one last question going back to the aluminum industry. In a circular supply chain, the customer also ultimately becomes the supplier of scrap materials, which we need as input for the circular economy. What challenges do you see based on that, on those multi-flow supply chains, and also on the rising protectionism we have to protect scrap as input for the circular economy?
Thanks, it's a great question. So, taking perhaps the first part in terms of, I think there's a huge amount on education and awareness building, actually. We sort of talk in the same kind of circles and everyone seems aware of the circular economy, but actually you go out into the public and, the education and the awareness sometimes just isn't there. And that's a big step to overcome. And actually that then leads into kind of behavior change and, a completely different mindset. So, we're talking about building new models and circular economy approaches. This, I think, hasn't necessarily flowed out into the wider public, and certainly for the aluminium industry. And when you're talking about something like packaging and the aluminium can, which is, very tangible for the members of the public, it's a lot about education and about, how important it is to actually make sure that your can is going into the recycling bin and not into the landfill bin. Something as simple as that can really make quite a big difference at the end of the day. Through recycling today, we actually save about 300 million tons of emissions from the aluminium sector because we recycle. Because recycling for aluminium is only about 5% of the energy compared to producing it from primary material. So every can that comes back in is, displacing essentially the need for new resources, more energy being, to produce that new material. So, yeah, I would say the education gap is a big one. Coming to kind of protectionism and scrap, now I feel like there has been a bit of a switch in terms of, you know, people starting, certainly kind of policymakers really starting to understand the value of scrap. Previously, particularly in some of the developed economies, you know, if you had scrap, it was being exported, you weren't necessarily seeing the value of that material. And now we've kind of seen a shift in people's mindsets of actually, this is a resource that we're sending, you know, to other parts of the world. It's a resource that we're not fully utilizing. And so we are starting to see policies come in that are, you know, intended to keep some of that resource base in country. Similar to what we're seeing upstream around, you know, critical materials and minerals and strategic, you know, minerals and materials. Aluminium is sort of in a lot of jurisdictions recognized for its importance as a material that is part of the transition. It's used in a lot of electrical infrastructure, in electric vehicles, and actually the scrap resource is a great resource for you to utilize and to make much better use of than exporting it to other parts of the world. So it is on the rise, and I think we will probably see more and more of that as we move forward.
Thank you, and I think that's a very good handover now, touching upon the governmental requirements in order to make the circular economy happen. We've heard from your speech, Matthias, that Sweden is leading the way. You have companies that are really outstanding in terms of circular economy. You managed IKEA, H&M, but also Volvo. From my work, I know that the further you go down the rabbit hole of circular economy, the more problems arise. For example, you have a refurbished part in the automotive industry, and you don't know how to market it because certain things are currently in the policy landscape are not foreseen. So, from your point of view and from Sweden's experience, what do you think is required most in order to make circular economy, but also circular supply chains happen?
Thanks. I think you're highlighting really sort of one of the key issues for us in terms not only of circularity but climate action more generally as well. Because I think our experience is that as we progress in the transition to net zero, the various conflicts of interests are becoming more and more apparent. Or even between sort of climate action and environment. Where if you're building wind farms, you need a lot of space, and you take up a lot of, in our case, woodlands. So how do you sort of strike that balance between ensuring that you sort of build that kind of wind power you need, but at the same time conserving nature? So in those kind of policy challenges you would need to address in some way. And I guess the success of our transition is also depending on us as countries to be able to resolve those kind of differences. And I think the examples also that you're mentioning, that sort of as you were progressing in the transition, we're seeing also those kind of challenges coming up in a number of different sectors, but also on a more horizontal level. And I guess the way for us at least to try to come about this, or to try to grapple with it, is on the one hand transparency and being open about these. Being open about these kind of challenges that we face and these potential conflicts of interest, but then of course also designing policy processes which cater to these various types of conflicts of interest, and being transparent in how you solve them. And I think it's probably fair to say that you won't be able to solve them always in a way which sort of caters to everyone's interests, but rather sometimes you have to make decisions which probably, on balance, might not be seen as beneficial to all various types of actors in that particular process. But I guess the awareness about that is also one key element to ensure also that those kind of policies are accepted. That you can explain why you're taking various types of steps. So to make that sort of one, maybe more sort of reflection on those kinds of conflicts of interest. But I think also from a policy side, again, setting having that sort of on a different types of time scales as well. In our case, we set ourselves our 25 net zero target, so that's very clear in terms of our policy guidance for both government and business actors. But then, of course, as you break that down into both sort of timelines and looking into various sectors, you have to be more clear, provide more clarity in terms of, which sector needs to go at what speed. And for example, in our case, we have something we call the Fossil Free Sweden initiative, which the government set up some 10 years ago. Where now, I think it's 80% of the Swedish economy is covered by what we call roadmaps for fossil-free competitiveness, which have been developed by the business sectors themselves. So in those roadmaps, they then make commitments in terms of we as the transportation sector or the dairy sector or the agriculture sector, we propose that we will be fossil free by a certain point in time, 2035. But in order for us to get there, we need these kind of policy requirements to be put in place. So there's also that kind of interaction between policy and the business actors in terms of what is needed to drive this transition even further. So that kind of dialogue, I would say, also is a useful component of policy development. Maybe just a final element as well. I mean, in addition to sort of having those kind of long-term targets, I mean, in our case also, I would say that, you know, when we speak to our business actors, what they need sort of to accelerate their transition, I mean, this is more sort of on a global scale, but I mean, their single most repeated answer is a price on carbon. That is also sort of what helps drive the transition because it makes it more expensive to use fossil fuels in any kind of way. And of course, that also helps circularity because, you know, you're phasing out carbon-intensive products from your value chain because you see that they are getting increasingly expensive. I think we have the highest carbon tax in the world, and you can talk to our business actors. I think most of them would say that they're still fairly competitive at least. But of course, we're seeing that this kind of drive for introducing carbon pricing globally is something which we at least would be hoping more and more countries are picking up on. I think today there are some 60 countries having some kind of carbon pricing mechanism. And for example, we're engaged in something we call the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action, where countries get together to compare how those kind of policy frameworks can be set in place. So that's just another example of how governments can be collaborating to drive the transition to net zero.
I would actually like to connect with one question. We are doing this transition on running operations. We can't pause the economy. We can't pause companies and say, let's wait until we have all policies in place, until we have our plans in place, and then we can get started again. But we need to do this while we operate. And of course, there's always the ask to put policies in place, but I would like to turn that around. You mentioned a couple of companies that are leading the way, but there's still a lot of companies waiting for more clarity on policies and regulation and standards. As a government, if you could ask or wish for certain topics for the private sector, what would you wish for them to drive first and for them to lead the way on circular economy?
That's a good question. I guess the business actors themselves have, they are better versed in the kind of solutions that they can provide. But again, turning to the Swedish pavilion here at COP29, what we hope to be portraying there are the solutions that business actors can provide. And by having them present here, we're hoping also to encourage more governments to apply or to adopt more ambitious policies based on the fact that there are solutions available. So I think what I would hope to see from business actors more generally, not only Swedish business actors, but colleagues like Schneider Electric here as well, to highlight the kind of solutions that are available. And by doing so, instilling that kind of confidence with policymakers that it is possible to set high targets because that solutions are available, both when it comes to climate action more generally, but also, of course, when it comes to circularity, to proving that circular business models are possible to adopt, and that, of course, as you're saying, you can't adopt everything at once, and you can't stop to wait because you need something else in place, but rather by testing both policy-wise and also business-wise, that there are solutions evolving, and by highlighting those kind of solutions, also providing that kind of confidence to policymakers. So I think what I would hope and wish from business actors is really to showcase the kind of solutions that you already have and make sure that policymakers are aware that those solutions are available. And by doing so, we can instill that kind of confidence.
Thank you. And I think solutions is a very good keyword. For the circular economy, we also need to rely on innovation, specifically also on technological innovation. So Penel, in the aluminum industry, going back to metals or base materials, related industries, maybe also such as the cement industry, what are the technology solutions and innovations you are all hoping for that would make a difference for circular supply chains?
So there's a few different fronts that the industry is sort of currently working on. There's I guess the more conventional recycling of the metal front. So one of the key challenges that we face is actually around sort of relatively low grade scrap. So when you have, scrap with lots of impurities, it's quite challenging then to kind of get that back into the system, because it's difficult to kind of get it back into the kind of quality that's needed for higher value products. So one of the kind of technologies that's being explored at the moment is how can you potentially upgrade some of those lower quality scraps, and that's, I guess, a really promising field for us, because at the moment we're losing a lot of that scrap to applications where it's not of as much value or of as much use. And so actually, if you can find a way to get rid of those impurities and to upgrade that scrap, you can then use it in much higher value and more sophisticated applications. So that's kind of one way, and that's simply the metal. Another way that kind of circularity is being looked at is actually through the greater use of some waste products from the industrial process itself. And that is kind of, I guess, really trying to think outside of the box. So the aluminium industrial process does generate certain amounts of solid waste. And rather than, storing that or it going to landfill, there are active programs looking at utilizing that as a feedstock material into other industries. So we have a couple of solid wastes that come out of our process called bauxite residue and spent pot lining. And we're working collaboratively with both the steel industry and the cement industry to look at how those waste products from our sector could be used as a feedstock into the cement and the steel industry. So some nice synergies there between kind of heavy industry and also, thinking about circularity a bit more broadly than just, a linear sort of one product to another, but actually looking at, all the different streams of materials in our processes. So I think, innovations and changes like those would really change the game, certainly for our sector. And I know it's kind of similar to things that are being looked at in other sort of heavy industries and other material sectors as well.
And I know that this principle is also heavily discussed in other industries. What is the scrap of one industry is a very valuable input for the other industry, but it requires very strong rethinking outside the box and collaboration. Another challenge I know through the work with different organizations is how to measure success of circular economy. I think it has taken us some time to really get used to measuring in CO2, which we by now do, and it's a currency we trade in by now. But circular economy is more complex because we touch upon so many different aspects of the circular economy. So Timothy, again to you, how is Schneider Electric measuring the progress in transitioning towards a circular economy?
Well, indeed, it's a key issue to develop some KPIs on circularity. First of all, we have some global commitments called Schneider Sustainability Impact and Schneider Sustainability Essentials. These global commitments are around sustainability, climate, circularity, resources, and they are directly linked with our financial bonuses at the end of the year. So 60,000 employees on our 150,000 employees have these financial incentives linked with our sustainability, climate, circularity commitments. So this is very important because, well, all is about money and all is about incentivizing internally and externally. So this is how actually we can bring circularity into the boardroom, to link it with financial incentives. We also use for our own products so-called product environmental profiles. It's a kind of synthesis of the life cycle assessment. And of course, we measure with avoided emissions, with the GHG emissions, with the tons of products we repair each year. We have also a program called Green Premium Program, and we have 75% of our products that are into the Green Premium Program. And our objective is that by 2025 is to mine 50% of green materials. So we have an internal label to assess what is a green material and what is not. We also commit to purchase to have 100% packaging, single plastic use free by 2025. And we also measure site by site. We have like 200 sites into the waste to resources program. So there are many measurements, many data to measure and report circularity.
Thank you. I have really enjoyed this panel discussion, and I think we could go on for maybe another hour, but I have learned we have to be very strict on time here, so I would take a couple of minutes to sum it up. I think we are all on the way towards circular economy, but what we also learned, and I think that's also next to the financing question of this COP, a very big theme is collaboration. For the circular economy, we need collaboration on policies between private actors and between governments. We need collaboration on innovation between silos, not just within one company, but we need to think outside of the corporate boundaries. We need to think outside countries in order to innovate and find new solutions. We need the right skills and people. I think that is something that is very often overlooked when we talk about the circular economy, because we really need to rethink. And last but not least, we need to measure success. We need to find a way in how we can measure the transition, not just in terms of CO2, but also in terms of how we exploit the planet and how we stop that by transitioning from the linear to the circular economy. And as we learned, Matthias, from your speech, that it is possible to reduce 48% of emissions through the circular economy by 2030. I think we have a unique opportunity here, and not just a unique opportunity, but we have to take up the principles of the circular economy if we want to meet the Paris Agreement. Thank you.